This is BBC News with the latest business headlines for viewers in the UK and around the world. US tech shares narrowly missed their worst January, but Spotify continues to be in the spotlight. The Lunar New Year begins as COVID weighs on celebrations. We discuss if this is a sign of what's ahead in 2022. India presents its union budget as the country struggles to continue its economic recovery from COVID-19. And a look at how the theatre industry is keeping its curtains raised even amid all the COVID restrictions. Welcome to the program. After a brutal month, tech shares rallied on Wall Street, narrowly avoiding their worst ever start in 2022. The Nasdaq actually had its best one-day gain in almost a year, but it still closed out January down almost 9%. And Spotify shares closed higher as well, despite the controversy of its most popular podcaster. It's come under pressure after mounting criticism that the music streaming platform is allowing Joe Rogan to spread misinformation about COVID-19 and vaccines. It's prompted artists like Neil Young and Joni Mitchell asking for their music to be removed from the platform. Spotify now says it's working to add advisory warnings to any podcast discussing COVID-19, but critics say that's not enough. Let's bring in Chris Cook, who's the managing director at 3CM Unlimited. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. Firstly, Joe also apologized. Spotify CEO also spoke out, but do you think they've done enough?
Well, if you look at the social media posts coming from the sort of the music and artist community following those announcements and those statements on Sunday evening, I would say that most of Joe Rogan's critics and Spotify's critics amongst the artist and music community are not that placated by what was said on Sunday evening. They're still being critical. For example, they are saying, well, what you're saying is what YouTube and Twitter and Facebook have said about the need to have policies to deal with misleading content. But the Joe Rogan podcast is your podcast. It's not like when people are uploading content to those other platforms. So I think within the artist community, there's still a lot of critics, although I do think that possibly it will push back the controversy for a few weeks to give Spotify the opportunity to try and placate the big name artists one-on-one.
As you say, Spotify is hardly alone in coming under pressure about misinformation. But how different is Spotify's controversy compared to others like Facebook and Google? Because as I understand, Spotify relies on subscribers, there's no ad revenues and so on.
Yeah, I suppose Spotify's business model is a little bit different from those other social media and user upload platforms. I mean, Spotify does have an advertising side to the business, and in terms of its podcasts, that's important for the ad side of the business. But Spotify makes the vast majority of its revenues by selling premium subscriptions, and I think there's two sides to that. Firstly, although Spotify has been pushing into podcasting, aggressively for a number of years now, and the Joe Rogan deal was a big part of that, many of those premium subscribers, the majority of those premium subscribers, the people who are paying to subscribe, what they want access to is the music. So therefore, music is a really important part of Spotify's business, despite the podcast prioritization in recent years. Also, it does mean that when there is a little bit of a controversy like what has been building in the last couple of weeks, there's the risk you start to see a significant number of subscribers cancelling. Now, whether or not that's really significant numbers, probably not. But I mean, it will put some fear at the business and with investors in the business. Are we going to see people starting to end their subscriptions, stop putting money in because of the controversy that has surrounded the business?
And speaking of those artists, how dependent is Spotify on them? Can even bigger celebrities possibly pull their music out?
How easy it is for any one artist to pull their music depends on various different factors. Usually there is a record label sitting between an artist and Spotify, and to what extent an artist can just pull their content, ultimately depends on their deal with the label. I mean, Neil Young, obviously, who began all of this, he actually said in a post on his website he didn't have the right to unilaterally remove his music from Spotify. He needed his label to support him in this, which they did. So I think there is that complication in terms of whether artists can pull. And then I guess for sort of bigger name artists, Spotify is an incredibly important revenue stream for them and their labels today. And it's a really important way of reaching fans. And I think, some artists will be a little bit nervous of, do I want to get involved in this? Joe Rogan is a very popular podcast. Are there Joe Rogan fans among my fan base? So there'll be all sorts of questions that the bigger name artists will be asking, or indeed all artists will be asking. But it's the big name contemporary artists. If they were to start pulling content, then that, I think, would really ramp up the controversy further.
Indeed, the saga continues. Chris Cook, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
And
of course, we'll have more on Spotify earnings and other tech earnings later in the program. But meanwhile, Austria is introducing compulsory vaccinations on Tuesday, making it the first European country to require jabs by law. Penalties for rule breakers have been pushed back until the middle of March, but it's likely to see unvaccinated adults fine up to 3,600 euros. That's about $4,000. So far, just over 70% of Austrians have been fully vaccinated against the virus, and this is seen as a litmus test for economies and businesses across Europe as other nations consider similar measures. Well, joining me now is Christian Schulz, who's an economist at Citi. Thank you so much for joining us. I guess the Austrian government is hoping that this will allow them to reopen the economy, but at the same time, the country has seen regular protests ever since the announcement. So is this kind of measures good for the economy and businesses?
Well, I think many people would argue it comes a bit late, at least for the current Omicron wave. I mean, we've had experiences in the past, for instance, with the Delta wave in Israel, where it seemed that a big vaccination campaign can even resolve a current wave. But with Omicron and how transmissible it is, it seems unlikely that a big vaccination campaign or mandatory vaccinations will end the current wave. It's more about future waves, that the Austrian population is ready for future waves, that we will not see a need for lockdowns again because people won't go to hospital. And also, I think very importantly, that we can shorten quarantine times and therefore keep people in the workforce and prevent all this disruption that we're seeing all over the supply chains at the moment.
Germany and other European countries are also considering this. Do you expect more countries to adopt similar measures?
I think at the moment it looks quite unlikely that we'll see lots of countries following Austria's lead. When Austria did this, it was in the middle of a big wave and had one of the lowest vaccination rates in Western Europe. One of the effects of the announcement was that lots of people got the vaccination before it was actually introduced. And so I think from today's perspective, Austria probably wouldn't introduce this. It just had to follow through. And we have a similar phenomenon in Germany. When it was announced, lots of people got the jab. Now that they really have to implement it, they find lots of practical difficulties, and we may actually not see it in the end.
And how are companies and businesses dealing with this?
Well, from their perspective, of course, anything that ends the lockdowns and the quarantines is going to be a good thing. At the same time, where we have sector-wise mandatory vaccinations, for instance, for the health sector, many businesses in the sector, private hospitals, for instance, find it actually quite difficult to implement this, as they do with all sorts of measures, such as keeping people without vaccinations out of shops or workplaces and so on. So it imposes a big burden of bureaucracy sometimes on them. So even in the business sector, I think there's a lot of skepticism towards mandatory vaccinations.
Christian Schulz, thank you so much for joining us on the program today. In other business news, starting today, vaccinated holidaymakers can once again travel to Thailand quarantine-free. This month alone, the government there is expecting between 200,000 and 300,000 visitors to enter the country under the revamped Test and Go program. They'll have to undergo 2 PCR tests on the first and 5th day after arriving and show proof of bookings at designated hotels on those specific dates. This step is expected to provide a significant boost to the tourism the country depends on. Now, it's been a year since Myanmar's military ousted the country's democratically elected government, and the US UK and Canada have all imposed new sanctions on the country's regime. A lot of investments into the nation before the coup also came from Asia, and those companies have been caught up in this tricky situation. Let's bring in our business reporter, Nick Marshall, who has been following the situation in Myanmar closely. So, Nick, where are we when it comes to all these investments that we used to talk about from Asia into Myanmar 1 year on?
Yeah, well, we know that foreign companies have been reacting in lots of different ways to the coup. This isn't the first set of sanctions, of course, from Western countries against key Burmese officials as well. This time, the UK, the US and Canada have gone after the Supreme Court's new Chief Justice. They're head of the Anti-Corruption Commission. The UK has also targeted the new head of the Election Commission as well. These men were obviously all highly involved in the arrest and conviction, most would say political persecution, of the former civilian elected leader Aung San Suu Kyi. But the sanctions also targeted key business leaders who are close to the military. The idea is to try and hurt the Burmese generals economically as much as possible. We know the Burmese economy has suffered massively since the coup. Several Western countries have been pulling out or they're considering pulling out. We've seen Chevron, Total, Telenor as well, the big Norwegian telecommunications company. They all say that the business environment is just too much for them to handle. But pulling out, as we know, is not the simple solution that it seems. We know that foreign investment creates jobs. It can help the lives of ordinary Burmese people as well. And there are those who make the argument that pulling out just leaves a bigger slice of the economic pie for the military junta. That's an argument that's being made by the opponents of the junta as well. So we're going to have to wait and see just what effect is going to have on the country. It's a dilemma, isn't it, Mariko? You don't want to abandon the Burmese people and pull out, but you don't want to do business there and risk conferring legitimacy to the military government, or worse, help keep it afloat economically.
Nick Marsh, thank you so much for that update. Stay with us on BBC News, is still to come. It's a big week for tech.
This is the moment that millions in Iran.
But will the tech giant be the winner from the pandemic, continue their run of good luck?
This is the moment that millions in Iran have been waiting for. After his long years in exile, the first hesitant steps of Ayatollah Khomeini on Iranian soil.
South Africa's white government has offered its black opponents concessions unparalleled in the history of apartheid, and the ANC leader Nelson Mandela is to be set free unconditionally.
3, 2, a countdown to a critical moment. The world's most powerful rocket ignited all 27 of its engines at once. And apart from its power, it's this recycling of the rocket, slashing the cost of a launch, that makes this a breakthrough in the business of space travel.
2 Americans have become the first humans to walk in space without any lifeline to their spaceship. One of them called it a piece of cake.
Thousands of people have given the yachtswoman Ellen MacArthur a spectacular homecoming in the Cornish port of Falmouth after she smashed the world record for sailing solo around the world non-stop.
This is BBC World News, the latest headlines. A lackluster Lunar New Year celebrations this year as COVID weighs on China's economy. And we take a look at how a theatre production company kept its lights on during the pandemic. Now, it's another week of tech earnings. The sector has been among the biggest winners from the pandemic, but those companies now face challenges as supply chain problems persist. Here's our North America technology reporter, James Clayton.
Well, both Google and Facebook have very similar revenue streams, completely dependent on advertising, and so when they report, you get a flavour of the digital economy. For Meta, they're going to be reporting their virtual reality figures for the first time. Remember, Mark Zuckerberg committed $10 billion to create this metaverse last year. I'm sure that will have affected profits. It'll be interesting to see more about that. Apple also released its new ad tracking feature last year. That was supposed to hurt Facebook. It was going to prevent advertisers tracking you around the internet, key to Facebook's business model. We'll probably hear more about that in the earnings call. For Google, well, they haven't had a very successful last month or so. Share price has gone down a lot, so we'll be hearing more not just about Google ads, but also YouTube and also Google Cloud too. These two companies have had a really, really successful pandemic, and so this is really the moment where we work out whether that continued all the way through 2021 or whether it started to tail off.
Well, let's bring in Gervais Williams, head of equities at Premier Milton, who joins us live. Thank you so much for joining us. I guess despite the rally overnight, the tech-heavy Nasdaq had a pretty brutal January. And yet when you see all these earnings coming out of those tech giants, they seem to be doing still really well. What are you expecting from Meta as well as Alphabet?
I mean, what we have seen is actually the sort of the sell-off in the equities in the sort of technology equities actually finished at the beginning of last week. We saw a bit recovery towards the end of the week and particularly into the beginning of this week. So when you look at Alphabet, what we're seeing here is a company reporting its full year figures. There have been very substantial upgrades really over the last 12 months. And we've got a business here where actually all 50 of the 51 analysts are actually recommending a buy at the moment.
And we keep talking about the supply chain issues, and yet Apple reporting last week didn't seem to have been affected by it. Is that still a big challenge for those tech giants?
Yes, I mean, many of these social media companies or companies which do online businesses are obviously less affected by the supply chain problems. And so from that point of view, they're able to sustain quite good growth. On top of that, of course, we have got quite a lot of inflationary pressures coming through. Wage inflation particularly is coming through, and it'll be very interesting to see what they report on that.
And what about the regulatory clampdown by the government? Is that still a big issue for those tech giants?
I mean, these companies are obviously very, very substantial in their own right. If you take Alphabet, for example, it's a $1.8 trillion company. Even Meta is actually nearly $1 trillion. So they're both very substantial businesses. They have very substantial market positions. And in that regard, they've really outclassed their competition. And the regulators are interested as to whether actually they've got trust issues and whether they need to break these up in due course.
And we keep talking about metaverse being the hottest thing. Is that your view?
Well, I think it's attracting very substantial interest. And so from that point of view, it's continuing to thrive. Again, it's a company where there's been substantial upgrades over the last 12 months in spite of the uncertainties. So that's been a key issue. But going forward, I think actually what we will see is actually inflationary pressures becoming more persistent. I think interest rates will go up. I think wage inflation will be quite significant. And I think that will start to favour some of the more traditional companies, as we saw earlier in January when we saw many of these companies peaking out.
Gervais Williams, thank you so much for joining us on the program today. And let's quickly show you how Wall Street did, because as I mentioned, the Nasdaq actually made a bit of a comeback, up by more than 3%. And also the Dow and the S&P not doing too badly on the last day of January after that brutal month. And here in Asia, we have a lot of the markets closed because of course, the Lunar New Year's. But Nikkei is taking their cue from Wall Street, though it is pretty flat to higher. And let's now go to India, because the country's finance minister, Nirmala Sitharaman, has just presented its union budget. Of course, it comes at a time when the economy is struggling to keep the recovery going because of the third wave of COVID-19 infections. But with impending elections in some key states, what is the focus of this budget? Well, let's bring in Archana Shukla, our India business correspondent, who joins us live from Mumbai. So talk us through exactly what's been announced so far.
Well, you know, the initial few minutes of the budget, which is the second paperless budget that the Union Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman is presenting today, the first few minutes have highlighted what was the biggest ask: increasing expenditure on infrastructure development. And the infrastructure push is the major key takeaway from the first few minutes, with investments being lined up to invest in from railways to highways. She's also spoken about jobs, made a mention over there and said that the expansion in the infrastructure projects and construction would lead to some of the jobs being created. As she started reading out her presentation, her budget presentation, she did mention that the presentation would lay out a roadmap for the next 25 years for the country, and that would be built with an inclusive growth where the government's focus is to look at the macro futuristic growth, but also something that is inclusive for all sections of the society. So big infra push is the biggest key takeaway from the initial few minutes.
Achana, thank you so much for that update. And of course, the Lunar New Year celebrations are now underway, but gatherings and parties remain low-key because of further coronavirus outbreaks, as well as strict lockdowns in China. The region's increasing vaccination rates, though, is raising hopes that the Year of the Tiger will see life return to normal. But of course, the Omicron variant continues to disrupt production in China. Let's bring in Ginny Yan, who's a chief China economist at ICBC Standard Bank, who joins us live. Thank you so much for joining us. It feels like zero COVID policy is really starting to affect China's economy. But at the same time, with the Winter Olympics just about to start, it's unlikely that Beijing will soften its approach, is it?
No, it's very unlikely that the restrictions will be lifted, but also let's remember it's Chinese New Year. This is the time when the mobility around China across different regions is at its maximum peak. So obviously the key is to minimize the disruption on a longer term basis, of course, even without the Winter Olympics. But yes, this year, obviously the upcoming Winter Olympics has put a lot of strain on further expectations that restrictions will be stricter even than it would have been so if it wasn't the case. But certainly the economy has been slowing even before this. The COVID cases, of course, are slightly more than previously, but I think even in any standards on a global context, the cases are still relatively low.
Indeed, Ginny Yan, thank you so much for joining us and happy Lunar New Year to you. Now, Omicron and the possibility of new variants have forced many businesses to go digital to stay open over the past 2 years. But one industry that found it difficult to keep its curtains raised is theatre, because it's hard to translate the drama of stage plays online. But one production company here in Singapore found a way to put itself back in the spotlight.
Look, I know you have the gift of communicating with them.
And who are you?
I'm Aaron's buddy.
You also commando like Aaron. How can?
What do you mean, how can?
And it's strange, like, I've done so many more things than I would have on the regular non-COVID year. It's just now getting to understand what the audience wants. How does the whole economy work? Because the tectonic plates underneath have completely shifted and the industry is changing.
You cannot use the methods of yesterday to compete in the economies of tomorrow. And I think as you know, artists, as business owners, as entrepreneurs, we need to be adaptable to change because that's the only constant.
Why you never call page me anymore?
Watching a performance online is very quick and very fast. You know, I turn up 5 seconds before I click on the link, I'm there, and I can also click X and exit it immediately, you know, within seconds.
From here, basically, you also have this like interactive elements. You have these 2D animations coming in, so there's an animator who do all the fire and all the post-processing effects as well. And you have photogrammetry, which allows us to take a real-world image or item and turn it into this 3D model.
Now, all of a sudden, we are able to reach the world. And that's something very important to me because then we can make the per ticket price a little bit more affordable.
I will say, I'm fairly confident live theatre will never die. The whole world is shifting, and as artists, I think what we are looking to do is to find what people need. Yeah, because art does reflect life, and at this point I think there's a lot of healing that needs to be done.
What a nice creative way to keep going during the pandemic. With that, we end this edition of the program, but happy Lunar New Year to all of you celebrating Ogonsi Fatsai, as we say it here in Singapore. Of course, you can reach me on Twitter. I'm at BBC Mariko Oi, and Sally will be back with all the latest headlines at the top of the hour, so join us if you can. Thanks for watching.